The first time I really noticed her, I was doing something as mundane as watering the plants outside my apartment. The sunlight hit the leaves just so, glinting off the droplets of water, when I caught sight of her across the street. She moved with an effortless grace that made even the ordinary. Walking down the sidewalk, adjusting her scarf, brushing her hair from her face, looked like something out of a film. She wasn't striking in a way that shouted for attention. It was quiet, subtle, almost like the world paused for a fraction of a second when she moved through it. I froze for just a moment, realizing I'd been staring. My chest tightened, my palms suddenly warmer than usual. There was a rhythm to her movements, a calm confidence that seemed almost at odds with my own clumsy, nervous energy. She tilted her head slightly, sunlight catching the strands of her hair, and smiled. Not a casual, friendly smile, but one that felt knowing, aware. It made my stomach flip in a way I hadn't felt in years, and I quickly looked away, pretending to adjust the hose in my hand. Even in that brief glance, I noticed the details. The way her lips curved when she smiled, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes that hinted at a life well lived, the subtle elegance in her posture. Everything about her seemed deliberate yet effortless. I felt an odd mix of awe and hesitation. She was older than me, yes, but not just in years. There was a depth, a life experience, a quiet command of space that made me both intimidated and inexplicably drawn to her. I found myself wondering what she was thinking. Did she notice me staring? Did she know how acutely aware I was of her presence? My mind raced with questions I didn't dare voice, and yet a strange comfort settled over me in that small, silent connection. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but the impact lingered. The day stretched on, but that moment replayed itself in my mind with unnerving clarity. I noticed the way her scarf caught the wind, how she paused to glance at something far in the distance, how even the smallest gesture, the tilt of her shoulder, the subtle turn of her wrist, felt intimate, charged with meaning I couldn't yet decipher. It was more than attraction. It was curiosity, a pull toward someone who seemed both familiar and entirely unknown. By the time I finished watering the last of my plants, I realized I hadn't even blinked as I watched her from across the street. She had disappeared around the corner, leaving behind a quiet, almost tangible emptiness. And yet, in that void, I felt a strange anticipation, as if this was just the first chapter of something neither of us fully understood, but both of us had silently agreed to explore. In that moment, I understood the power of a glance, not just as a fleeting spark of attraction, but as the beginning of an unspoken story. And somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that this was just the start, the first step toward something I didn't yet have the words to name, but already knew I couldn't ignore. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. Life has a funny way of colliding with the moments you least anticipate. I was heading to the local corner store, my mind half on a grocery list and half on the lingering memory of her smile from across the street. The sunlight was softer now, slanting through the branches of the trees lining the walkway, casting dappled patterns across the pavement. And then she was there, standing by the entrance, browsing through a rack of magazines, her presence so effortless it made everything around her fade. My heart lurched, betraying my attempt at casual composure. She glanced up, and our eyes met again. It wasn't just a look this time. It felt intentional, charged. A quiet acknowledgement that, somehow, our worlds were brushing together once more. I felt my throat tighten, my hands suddenly clammy. I pretended to shift my bag on my shoulder, stealing a glance at her without seeming obvious. She tilted her head just slightly, a playful smirk tugging at her lips, and something in me twisted. A mix of anticipation, excitement, and nerves. As I stepped closer to the entrance, fate, or perhaps sheer coincidence, placed me right beside her. My hand brushed hers as we both reached for the same magazine. The contact was brief but electric, leaving a small warmth that lingered longer than it should have. I quickly withdrew, my pulse racing, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she held my gaze, calm and teasing, as if daring me to acknowledge the spark between us. "I didn't know you were into mysteries," she said softly, her voice smooth, with a quiet warmth that seemed to wrap around me. I stumbled over my words, muttering something incoherent, my embarrassment only heightened by the faint flush I felt creeping up my neck. She laughed. A soft, melodic sound that seemed to settle over me like a gentle embrace, and I realized how easily she could disrupt my composure. The world around us felt suddenly smaller. The hum of the store faded, the chatter of other shoppers dimmed, and all I could focus on was her. The subtle tilt of her shoulders, the way her hair caught the light, the easy confidence she exuded with each movement. There was a rhythm to her presence, a cadence that made me acutely aware of my own uncertainty. Every instinct screamed both caution and curiosity, and I was caught somewhere in between. When she finally looked away, scanning the magazine titles again, I noticed the quiet vulnerability in that brief pause, the softness in her gaze, the tiny hesitation in her movements. It was a glimpse of depth beneath the confident exterior, a reminder that she was as human as she was captivating. I left the store with a grocery bag in one hand and a heart pounding in the other, replaying every detail of that encounter. The brush of her hand, the warmth of her smile, the gentle teasing in her voice. They had lingered in my mind long after the sunlight had shifted and the streets had emptied. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't just a chance meeting. It was the beginning of something inevitable, an unspoken story waiting to unfold, one glance, one touch at a time. It wasn't a grand gesture, not yet. She didn't suddenly sweep me into her world or make any bold declarations. Instead, it was a quiet, almost imperceptible invitation. A brush of attention that made the air between us feel charged, intimate, and charged with possibility. It happened one evening on her porch. I'd been taking out the trash when I noticed her sitting in her favorite chair, a book resting lazily in her lap. The fading sunlight pooled around her, turning her hair into strands of gold, and I hesitated at the edge of the walkway, suddenly aware of how loud my own heartbeat sounded in my ears. She looked up, caught me staring, and instead of scolding or teasing outright, she simply tilted her head in that same graceful way that had captivated me from the beginning. Her smile was softer now, warmer, and infinitely more personal, as if she were letting me in, little by little. "Come sit," she said, patting the empty space next to her. The invitation was casual, almost careless, yet the way she looked at me made it clear it wasn't just about sharing a seat. I felt a flutter of nerves in my stomach, my hands twitching as if trying to decide whether they belonged in my pockets or reaching for the warmth beside her. Slowly, I stepped forward, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet evening. Once I settled beside her, the world contracted to this small porch, this brief stretch of time where nothing else existed. She leaned slightly closer to point out a line in her book, her fingers brushing mine in the motion. The touch was light, fleeting, but it left a lingering warmth, a reminder that proximity can speak louder than words. My breath caught, not from desire alone, but from the electric intimacy of being allowed into her personal space, of feeling her awareness of me as more than a passerby. We talked about trivial things at first, the weather, a neighbor's dog, a new recipe she had tried, but even the mundane became charged with significance. Every pause, every tilt of her head, every glance carried weight. I noticed the small, almost imperceptible ways she measured our closeness. The gentle lean toward me when she laughed, the way her hand lingered near mine, the soft sigh she let escape when she shifted in the chair. There was a rhythm to it, a dance that neither of us named aloud. She was daring me, not with words, but with presence, testing the boundaries of our connection, seeing if I was willing to meet her halfway. And somewhere deep inside, I knew I wanted to. I wanted to lean in, to let myself feel the pull she had ignited from the very first glance across the street. By the time the sun had fully dipped below the horizon, the porch was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Her book rested forgotten in her lap, her eyes lingering on mine with quiet amusement and unspoken understanding. I left that evening with the same lingering warmth I'd felt the first time our hands brushed, only now stronger, more insistent. It wasn't just attraction, it was an invitation, an unspoken dare to step closer, to let the tension between us grow into something neither of us had fully named but both of us could feel. The invitation came quietly, almost casually. She needed help with something small, groceries, a light shelf repair, a minor household task. It wasn't anything dramatic, yet the prospect of being inside her home, sharing even a fleeting moment of her private space, made my chest tighten in ways I hadn't expected. My mind buzzed with a mix of excitement and nervousness as I approached her door, rehearsing mundane greetings while secretly hoping I wouldn't trip over my own feet. She opened the door with her usual grace, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Thanks for helping," she said, her voice warm, calm, and comforting, the kind that makes the world pause for a heartbeat. Her presence filled the room, not just physically, but emotionally. It was quiet, homey, yet charged with an energy I couldn't fully name. I stepped inside, careful not to overstep, yet acutely aware of every subtle detail. The faint scent of her perfume mixed with vanilla from a candle, the way sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting patterns across the floor, the gentle hum of life in her space that somehow felt both inviting and intimate. We worked side by side, our movements naturally falling into a rhythm. As I handed her a grocery bag or held a shelf steady, our hands brushed occasionally, each contact lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. My pulse quickened each time, a warm, fluttering reminder of the unspoken tension between us. She noticed, of course, in that way she always did. A soft glance, a playful smirk, a tilt of her head that spoke volumes without saying a word. As the chore ended, we lingered, neither wanting to break the fragile intimacy that had settled between us. She leaned against the counter, casually but deliberately close, and I found myself drawn to her warmth. There was something grounding in her presence, her quiet confidence balanced by subtle vulnerability, a glimpse into the life behind the poised exterior. She shared a small story from her day, laughing softly at a memory, and I felt the weight of her honesty, the trust inherent in opening herself, even in a seemingly trivial anecdote. I noticed every detail, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the gentle cadence of her voice, the faint brush of her hair as she tucked it behind her ear. For a moment, it felt like the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only the two of us suspended in a quiet, delicate connection. Her hand brushed mine as she reached for something on the counter, a simple touch that seemed laden with intent, a silent acknowledgement of the closeness that had grown between us. By the time I left, I was acutely aware of the subtle intimacy of the afternoon. It wasn't dramatic or overt. It was the quiet assurance of presence, the warmth of shared space, the trust of vulnerability, and the fleeting brush of fingers that lingered in memory. I realized, with a mix of exhilaration and humility, that slow moments like this often held more weight than any grand gesture. And as I stepped back into the sunlight, I carried with me the quiet understanding that something delicate, profound, and quietly irresistible was beginning to bloom. A connection built not on urgency or spectacle, but on patience, attention, and the intimacy of shared moments that neither of us would soon forget. That evening felt suspended in time. The sky had shifted to a soft, dusky palette, streaked with rose and amber, and the world seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for something unspoken to unfold. I found myself on her porch again, drawn by a quiet, irresistible pull. She was already there, settling into her chair with that effortless grace that had captured my attention from the very first glance. The fading sunlight painted her hair with gold, lending a warmth to her presence that made the air around us feel electric. We didn't speak immediately. Words seemed unnecessary. Instead, we shared the silence, sitting close enough that the space between us felt almost intimate, yet far enough that it maintained a delicate tension. I noticed the subtle ways she adjusted her posture, the faint inclination of her head toward me when she laughed at some private thought, the gentle way her hand rested near mine. Each gesture felt deliberate, though unspoken, like a quiet invitation to bridge the distance. A soft breeze carried the scent of her perfume, vanilla and something faintly floral, through the evening air. It was intoxicating in a subtle, almost dizzying way. When it brushed against my cheek, mingling with the warmth of the fading sun, I became acutely aware of her presence beside me. My chest tightened. My hands itched to reach for her, but I restrained myself, letting the tension build instead. There was a beauty in this unspoken restraint, in the electricity of possibility suspended in the quiet of the moment. At one point, our fingers nearly touched as she reached for her cup of tea. The hesitation lingered in the space between us, long enough for my heart to race, short enough that we were still safe within our own boundaries. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes catching mine with that teasing, knowing look she had perfected over the weeks. It was as if she were silently daring me, testing the strength of my courage, seeing whether I would meet her halfway without needing words. We talked sparingly, our voices low and casual, but every pause, every glance, every slight lean carried weight. I could feel the unspoken understanding growing, the quiet acknowledgement of mutual desire tempered by patience and respect. Each time she smiled or laughed, it lingered just long enough to send a shiver down my spine, yet never crossed into overt intimacy. By the time the sun had disappeared below the horizon, the porch was bathed in twilight, the soft shadows enhancing the delicate tension between us. I felt as if we were suspended in our own private world, a space where words could not reach and touch had to wait, but every near miss, every subtle gesture, was a promise of connection. As I left that evening, my mind replayed every nuance. The tilt of her head, the brush of her hair, the almost touch of our hands, the warmth radiating from her presence. Silent tension, I realized, could be more intoxicating than any spoken declaration. And in that quiet ache of longing, I understood that our story was moving forward, not with grand gestures, but with small, electric moments that neither of us would soon forget. The air between us had grown heavier over the past weeks, charged with moments of fleeting touch, lingering glances, and conversations that danced around unspoken truths. That evening, I found myself back on her porch, the sky a soft indigo now, speckled with early stars. The world was quiet, almost reverent, as if it too sensed the tension and anticipation swirling between us. She leaned against the railing, her posture relaxed yet deliberate, her eyes catching mine with a mix of curiosity and amusement. "I've noticed something," she said softly, almost teasing, though her voice carried an undercurrent of seriousness. My heart skipped a beat, my palms suddenly clammy. I realized she had finally decided to confront the unspoken energy that had been building between us. "I've seen the way you watch me," she continued, her gaze steady, warm, and unwavering. "Why don't you come inside and prove you're not just a shy boy?" The words struck me like a gentle but undeniable spark. It wasn't an accusation or a challenge. It was an invitation, a key turning in a lock I hadn't even realized existed. My throat tightened as I swallowed, trying to find the words, but before I could, she smiled. A quiet, knowing smile that softened the moment, yet heightened the tension. I felt my pulse racing, every nerve alert, and yet there was a strange sense of calm under the storm of emotions. I stepped closer, careful, deliberate, yet emboldened by the unspoken trust between us. I've been meaning to," I admitted, my voice low, carrying a mix of nerves and sincerity. "I wasn't sure if it was okay." She laughed softly, the sound wrapping around me like a gentle embrace. "It's more than okay," she said, resting a hand lightly on my forearm, her touch grounding and warm. The simple contact made my chest tighten in the most wonderful way, each heartbeat echoing the unspoken desire between us. Her fingers brushed mine subtly, lingering just enough to make the moment intimate without crossing any boundaries. We moved inside, the quiet comfort of her home enveloping us. She offered me a seat, and I noticed how the soft lighting accentuated the warmth of the room and the gentle contours of her face. Our conversation started casually, but the tension beneath the surface gave every word weight. I spoke honestly, hesitating at times, revealing fragments of my feelings and the fascination that had drawn me to her from the very beginning. She listened, leaning slightly closer, eyes soft yet intent, occasionally letting her hand brush mine as if to reassure me that my honesty was safe in her presence. By the end of the evening, there was no dramatic declaration, no sweeping confession of love. Instead, there was acknowledgement, a mutual recognition of curiosity, attraction, and the fragile excitement of beginning something real. The air was filled with a quiet intimacy, built not on urgency, but on patience, trust, and the simple courage of revealing one's heart. I left that night with a sense of lightness I hadn't expected. The tension that had been building for weeks had finally found a voice, a shared acknowledgement that our connection was no longer silent or one-sided. For the first time, I realized that desire could be tempered with respect, that attraction could be patient, and that the most meaningful relationships often begin with curiosity, honesty, and the courage to step forward, even when the outcome remains uncertain. The evening air was soft and still as I returned to her home, carrying the quiet anticipation that had been building between us over the past weeks. This time, there was no hesitation, no flutter of uncertainty, just the steady pull of familiarity and trust. She greeted me with that same gentle smile, the one that had captivated me from the first glance, but now it carried a new depth, warmth, reassurance, and something unspoken yet wholly mutual. We settled into her living room, the soft glow of lamps casting cozy pools of light over the space. Outside, the city hummed quietly, but inside, there was only the intimacy we had cultivated, unhurried and real. She poured us each a cup of tea, the steam curling gently, carrying the faint scent of herbs and warmth. I noticed the way her fingers lingered on the handle, the subtle grace in every small movement. My eyes traced the line of her cheek, the curve of her smile, the softness in her eyes that seemed to hold unspoken understanding. We talked, but the words were no longer necessary to convey meaning. The conversation flowed easily, each sentence layered with the comfort of mutual understanding and the gentle thrill of closeness. She leaned back slightly, and I found myself inching closer, drawn by the quiet magnetism that had been building since that very first glance across the street. When our hands brushed, lightly, casually, it was as if a spark passed between us, a confirmation of the connection that had been slowly, deliberately nurtured. At one point, she rested her hand on mine, letting her fingers curl slightly over mine. It was a simple touch, yet it carried all the weight of weeks of unspoken attraction and growing trust. My heart thudded against my chest, but the sensation was not frantic or anxious. It was warm, steady, grounding. I felt the intimacy of the moment not just with my body, but with my very self. The quiet comfort of her presence made the room feel safe, private, and wholly ours. There were no dramatic gestures, no overt declarations. Instead, there was a gentle closeness, a shared warmth that spoke louder than any words could. She tilted her head toward me, and I leaned in slightly, our shoulders brushing. A subtle, mutual acknowledgement passed between us, a quiet promise of more, of patience, of the slow, tender unfolding of something deeper. As the evening drew on, I realized how far we had come. From stolen glances across the street, to casual touches, to moments of honesty and trust, and finally, to this gentle intimacy where closeness and understanding had been fully realized. It was a culmination not of a sudden confession or dramatic act, but of patient, deliberate connection, the slow building of desire tempered by respect and genuine care. When I finally left, stepping back into the cool night air, I carried with me a sense of fulfillment and anticipation intertwined. The story was complete, not in a conventional, overtly romantic way, but in the most satisfying sense. Two people who had found each other, who had learned to see and trust and desire one another, ready to continue this slow, beautiful journey together. The quiet ache of longing had transformed into something warm, steady, and real, leaving me with the profound realization that sometimes, the most lasting romances are built not in grand declarations, but in patient, attentive presence and the gentle unfolding of shared hearts. If you felt the slow burn of their connection and want more heartwarming age gap romance stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment of this journey. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which part made your heart flutter the most.